Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for having this hearing. It's been very helpful, I think, for all of us to have an exchange of information. It's also been very troubling, to be frank with you. And, you know, one of my concerns from the start of this has been about the nature of the information that these hackers have received, and specifically information that is very sensitive that, as was mentioned earlier in the panel, the SF-86 is a form that you have to fill out to get a security clearance, and it includes highly confidential information, mental health history, issues about your personal life, and so on, that in the wrong hands can be very damaging, not just to that individual, but also to our national security. And so one of the concerns that I'd like to raise with you today is the extent to which this information you believe might be in the hands of our adversaries, and specifically, you know, what are we going to do about that? I realize that there's some sensitive matters here being discussed, but I think this has all been sort of out in the public, and if there's something you believe shouldn't be discussed in this setting, I know the Chairman is very eager to get this information also. We'd be happy to talk to you about it in a classified setting. So my first question, Dr. Osmond, is to you. Are we any closer to knowing what the scope of information was that's been accessed on this Federal Investigative Service Systems? Was it the SF-86 forms? Was it investigatory notes and supporting documents? They're also part of background information. Tell us what we know about that.
Senator Portman, I'll start the answer to that question, and with your permission, I'll ask Director Archuleta to complete it. Anytime you're trying to assess the impact of an intrusion, you have two activities that have to take place. First, the forensics investigators have to figure out essentially where did the adversary go, what did they have access to, and what did they do with the information they had access to. And you are rarely working with full evidence. If you think about a physical crime scene, you're looking for fingerprints, you're looking, you know, did somebody leave a half-smoked cigarette? You know, you're looking for clues, and that's what our forensics investigators are doing. It takes time, and sophisticated adversaries try to erase their tracks. They wear gloves so they don't leave fingerprints, and that is definitely the case here. So
what do we know?
So what we know is we continue to look at systems and see where were the adversaries, you know, were they on this system? We then have to work with OPM, and OPM has to say, this is what was on the system, which means that, you know, we can say the adversary was here. They have to be able to say, this is what was on the system. And I'll ask Director Archuleta to speak to that.
I'm glad to speak to that. On early June, our forensics teams advised the interagency, well, they advised me, I'll just say that. They advised me that there was a high confidence that the background investigation records had been compromised.
Okay, let me ask you another question. Dr. Osmond, there has been some discussion regarding whether these adversaries might have manipulated data in the background investigation databases that we've just heard from the Director. She has high confidence that those have been breached. They could have actually manipulated data in our federal government systems with regard to these background investigations. For example, to change the outcome of a clearance adjudication, remove derogatory information, maybe add derogatory information. Can you tell us anything about that possibility?
Sir, I can speak broadly. The adversary did have the type of access that could allow them to change information. I cannot speak to whether that, you know, a change of information would allow them to do any of the things that you specifically suggested there. I will say,
is it possible?
It is possible to change information. The implications of that I can't speak to. I will say, and I don't want to speak for my intelligence community colleagues, but I'll repeat what they said in a prior session, which is, and law enforcement colleagues, which is they view that as unlikely.
Is it possible that adversaries responsible for the breaches have also manipulated the data in the background investigation database itself?
I can say that the adversaries had the type of access that would allow them to manipulate some types of data. I don't know specifically what was on the databases that they had access to. I'd have to defer to OPM for that.
Director Archuleta, one thing we talked earlier is why we haven't responded more quickly. When did you first learn about these breaches?
We were notified of the breach that you're describing. The first breach occurred, I'll talk about both incidents. The first breach occurred in April. And
April of this year.
April of this year. And we were notified of the high, as I mentioned earlier, we were notified of the second breach, the high probability of extraction or exposure in June.
So these background investigations we're talking about here, the highly sensitive information we've known since June. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
We didn't know before that? Okay.
No, sir.
We talked earlier about you're not having met with the director of the FBI despite these incredible discrepancies in the information we're receiving from the two agencies. So I would hope the conclusion there is that you all are going to get one story for the American people. My constituents want to know, including the 10 million people who are wondering. Have you met with the Secretary of Defense or the Director of National Intelligence about this breach in the background information database and the potential impact it could have on their employees?
I have not met with them personally, no.
I would think that would be another obvious thing to do. I mean, my concern, again, was the concern I think every American should share, which is the most sensitive information in the most important national security agencies has now potentially been compromised. And I would hope that the FBI director who leads our counterintelligence efforts, as well as Secretary of Defense and DNI, would be involved in this effort.
May I just say that because I haven't met with them does not mean that they're not engaged in this effort. On the intelligence community issues, are issues I know that they're meeting about, but those are not issues as I am on the personnel records that I'm included in, but I do know that there have been meetings about that with them.
One final question, and this just sort of comes to me as we've been listening today to the testimony, you know, who should have this information, the most sensitive information we talked about. Department of Defense used to have it. OPM has it now. Clearly, with these breaches, this should be revisited. So I would ask you, Mr. Scott, do you believe the Department of Defense is a better place to have this sensitive information? Are they better prepared to handle it?
I have to say, Senator, I'm fairly new to the federal government. I don't have a comprehensive view at this particular point. This 30-day sprint that we're doing will look across a wide range of policy, practice, organization, resourcing, and a number of other things, and that certainly we can put on our list of something to come back with a...
The Federal Investigative Services is a specific area, Mr. Scott, where we would appreciate your input as to where you think that ought to reside. I don't know if you, Mr. Osmond, or you, Ms. Archuleta, have thoughts on that.
As a suitability agent, I work very closely with our security agent and OMB to really discuss the improvements that need to be made throughout the federal investigative background, and we've been working on that together and take very seriously that responsibility. I think we do a good job at this, and because we do work very closely with our partners on it, especially with DOD, to make sure that they're getting the type of background investigations in the quality and the timeliness that they deserve. And we are working very hard at that and making improvements all the time to be sure that we're delivering the product they deserve.
Thank you. My time has expired.